A staircase that climbs straight into a ceiling. A door on the second floor that opens onto nothing but a two-story fall. A window built into the floor, so you look down into a room instead of out at the sky. For more than a century, tour guides have walked visitors through these oddities with the same explanation. A grieving, guilt-ridden widow was told by a spirit medium that she was cursed, and that the only way to survive was to keep building forever so the ghosts could never catch up with her. It is one of the most famous ghost stories in America. And when researchers finally sat down with the actual paperwork, the letters, the bank records, the building permits, the probate filings, most of that story fell apart. What they found instead wasn't a haunted woman running from the dead. It was something far more human, and in its own way, far more interesting. Let's start with the house itself, because nothing about it is exaggerated. In San Jose, California, sits a sprawling Victorian mansion that once stood 7 stories tall before an earthquake knocked the top off. It has somewhere around 160 rooms, 10,000 or so windows, dozens of staircases, and a floor plan that no single blueprint could ever explain, because no single blueprint ever existed. There are cabinets that open onto blank walls. There is a chimney that never reaches the roof. There is a closet barely wide enough for a coat that hides a passage into a room nobody knew was there. Construction on this house ran, in some form, for roughly 38 years, from the mid-1880s until the owner's death in 1922. That part of the legend is completely true, and it's exactly why the story around it grew so large. A house this strange doesn't need embellishment to be fascinating. It only needs an explanation. And for 100 years, the explanation everyone reached for was ghosts. The woman at the center of it all was Sarah Winchester, widow of William Wirt Winchester, whose family fortune came from the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, the maker of the rifle nicknamed the gun that won the West. When her husband died, and with her only child having died in infancy years earlier, Sarah inherited an enormous fortune, and, according to the legend, an unbearable grief. The story that took hold claims she traveled to Boston to consult a famous spirit medium, who told her that her family was cursed by the vengeful ghosts of everyone ever killed by a Winchester rifle, and that those spirits had already taken her husband and her daughter. The only way to keep them from taking her too, the medium supposedly said, was to move west, buy a house, and never, ever stop building it. As long as the hammers kept swinging, the story goes, the ghosts couldn't find her. The moment construction stopped, she would die. So she fled to California, bought a modest farmhouse, and turned it into a labyrinth designed to trap and confuse the dead, nightly seances, secret blue rooms, and a superstitious obsession with the number 13 worked into staircases, windows, and chandeliers throughout the house. And when she died quietly in her sleep in 1922, the story ends with construction crews supposedly dropping their tools mid-swing, leaving nails half-driven and boards half-cut, because the curse, at last, was broken. It's a fantastic story. It has grief, guilt, money, and a body count attached to a famous name. It's also almost entirely undocumented, and once historians started pulling on individual threads, the whole thing came apart with surprising speed. Take the medium first, since he's the hinge the entire legend swings on. In most versions of the story, he's named Adam Coons, a Boston spiritualist influential enough to send one of the wealthiest women in America across the country on his word alone. If a figure like that existed, you'd expect to find some trace of him. Spiritualism was a huge, very public movement in that era, and its well-known mediums were written about, advertised, and argued over constantly in newspapers. But no record of an Adam Coons has ever turned up. No listing, no advertisement, no obituary, nothing from the era he supposedly operated in. His name doesn't appear anywhere until decades after Sarah Winchester's death, in a paperback collection of American ghost stories published in the 1960s, written for entertainment rather than as a documented history. Once that name appeared in one book, later writers simply repeated it, and repetition did what repetition always does. it made an invented detail feel like an established fact. The seance room tells a similar story. Tours still point to a small interior room in the house and describe it as the space where Sarah supposedly received nightly instructions from the spirit world, entering through one door and leaving through another to shake off any ghosts that might have followed her in. It's a wonderfully eerie detail to stand next to. It's also not supported by a single piece of evidence from Sarah's actual lifetime, no letter, no staff account, no visitor's diary mentions anything of the kind. The people who worked closely with her for years, her carpenters, her household staff, her foreman, described a demanding, private, extremely meticulous employer who paid unusually well. None of them described a woman taking dictation from spirits. The seance room label appears to have been attached to that space long after she was gone, by people who already knew what story they wanted the room to tell. Then there's the number 13, probably the single most repeated detail in the entire legend. 13 bathrooms, windows with 13 panes, staircases with 13 steps, a chandelier fitted for 13 candles. Visitors are encouraged to count them as proof of an obsessive, superstitious mind at work. But when historians went back to the earliest descriptions of the house, written while Sarah was still alive, the number 13 is essentially never mentioned. It doesn't show up as a defining feature of the house until a magazine article published years after her death went looking for a pattern, and unsurprisingly, found one. In a house with 160 rooms and thousands of windows, steps, and fixtures built up over nearly 4 decades, you can find plenty of groups of 13 if you go hunting for them. You can also find plenty of 12s, 14s, 7s, and 9s. Nobody counts those, because they don't make a good story. And the guilt at the center of it all, the idea of a woman haunted by the blood money behind her fortune, doesn't really hold up against the paper trail either. The documents that survive show someone who managed her own investments, read and negotiated her own contracts, and handled a large estate with clear-eyed competence for decades. That's not the profile of someone paralyzed by supernatural terror. It's the profile of a capable, wealthy person spending her fortune and her time on something that genuinely fascinated her. So how did a story with this little supporting evidence become the version repeated to millions of visitors for 100 years, printed right there on the ticket? Mostly because Sarah Winchester left almost nothing behind to contradict it. She gave no interviews. She wrote no memoir. She avoided photographers and reporters, wore a veil in public, and had the gates closed whenever curious onlookers showed up. She was, by every account, intensely private. And when she died, she left behind an enormous, strange house and almost no explanation of the woman who had built it. That kind of silence doesn't stay empty for long. A famous name, an eccentric mansion, a reclusive widow, and a firearms fortune with a body count attached, those are exactly the ingredients a good ghost story needs. And within about a year of her death, someone assembled them into one, because the house didn't sit quiet for long. It was leased and open to paying visitors almost immediately, and its new job wasn't to preserve the truth about Sarah Winchester. Its job was to sell tickets. And a story about a terrified widow being chased by ghosts sells a lot better than a story about an eccentric architecture enthusiast with a big budget, and no one telling her to stop. You can actually trace the legend growing in layers if you follow the record forward in time, the same way the house itself grew, one addition on top of the last. The earliest piece appears in a newspaper item from while Sarah was still alive, describing the strange rich widow endlessly enlarging her farmhouse. Piece built entirely from local rumor, since nobody had actually interviewed her. Even then, the shape of the myth is already visible in miniature. A woman who can't stop building, who fears what happens if she does. There's no medium mentioned yet, no specific curse, just gossip printed as fact because it made for better reading than the truth. But once that piece existed, it became something later writers could point back to, and every retelling added a little more confidence to what had started as an unsourced guess. The number 13 was bolted on by a magazine writer years later. The medium and the curse were bolted on by a paperback ghost story book decades after that. None of these pieces came from Sarah Winchester herself. Each one came from someone writing long after she was in a position to correct them, borrowing credibility from whatever had been printed before it, until the accumulated weight of repetition started to feel indistinguishable from evidence. It worked, in large part, because the timing was perfect. The years after Sarah's death were the golden age of the American roadside attraction, the carnival dark ride, the boardwalk sideshow, the Barker promising wonders just past the ticket booth. A vast, genuinely bizarre mansion attached to a famous rifle fortune and a mysterious veiled widow was a promoter's dream. Nobody even had to invent the strangeness of the building itself. The staircases really do climb into blank ceilings. The doors really do open onto empty air. All the story needed was a reason for it, and the reason that sold tickets was ghosts and madness, not an eccentric woman's decades-long hobby. So the same money that had shaped the house during Sarah's life kept shaping her legend after it, because the more haunted the house sounded, the longer the line at the gate. For most of a century, almost nobody with the standing to check the records actually went back and did it. Why would they? The story was already working. But eventually, someone did, spending years working through deeds, correspondence, probate filings, and the ordinary paper trail that any wealthy person generates simply by living a normal, well-managed life. And what emerged from all of that patient digging wasn't a woman ruled by fear. It was a fairly ordinary rich woman with an unusual hobby, who happened to be extremely private about it. Start with the money, since the legend's most repeated numbers, the idea that she poured a fortune of $1,000 a day, without pause, 4 decades, into construction, simply don't show up anywhere in her actual financial records. Those figures appear to have been invented by promoters because round, dramatic sums make for a better pitch than a careful accounting. What the real records show instead is a woman who diversified her investments, managed her holdings shrewdly, and left behind an estate that had clearly been tended rather than recklessly spent down. The move to California, so often framed as a widow fleeing across the country in terror, looks a lot more deliberate once you follow the paperwork. She relocated in the mid-1880s and bought a farmhouse in a fast-growing valley where land was cheap and about to become considerably more valuable. A real estate decision that reads like someone who understood real estate. There was also a much more mundane, human reason for the move. She suffered from rheumatoid arthritis, and her doctors had recommended a milder climate. California offered both opportunity for her money and relief for her joints, and she took both. And that brings us to the house itself, and to the oddly satisfying explanation for why it looks the way it does. There was no master architect, because she never hired one. She built the way a self-taught, endlessly curious person builds when she has essentially unlimited money, plenty of time, and nobody telling her no. A room added here because she wanted more light. A wing added there because she liked the view. Additions laid on top of additions for decades, without a single unifying blueprint guiding any of it. The hammering didn't continue for 38 years, because a medium forbade her from stopping. It continued because, for her, finishing was never really the point. Building was the hobby. Then, in 1906, the great earthquake tore through the region and hit the mansion hard, collapsing the top floors of the front section, the tallest, grandest part of the house. Sarah's response wasn't to rebuild it. She simply sealed the damaged section off and kept building in the parts that were still sound. In doing so, she orphaned everything that had once connected to that ruined wing. Staircases that had once climbed toward upper floors now climbed toward nothing, because the floors above them were gone. Doors that had once opened onto rooms now opened onto open air, because those rooms no longer existed. The most famous spooky features in the entire house, the stairs to nowhere, the doors to nothing, weren't built to trap ghosts. They were leftovers from an earthquake, and a practical decision not to rebuild something she'd already moved past. Even the strangest physical detail of the house, the tiny staircases that rise only a couple of inches per step, has an equally human explanation. Those are what builders call easy riser stairs, gentle enough for someone dealing with arthritic joints, and Sarah reportedly stood well under 5 feet tall. She built parts of the house to fit the body she actually had to live in, not to confuse anything supernatural. But here's where the story keeps a promise the legend actually got right. There really are secret rooms in that house, and what was found inside them is arguably more moving than any ghost story. In 2016, staff working through the mansion opened a sealed attic space that had been closed off since Sarah's death in 1922. Inside, undisturbed for nearly a century, they found a pump organ, a Victorian couch, a dress form, a sewing machine, and a scattering of paintings, as if someone had stepped out for a moment and simply never come back. There was no evidence of ritual, no curse markings, nothing supernatural at all. Just the quiet, private belongings of a woman who apparently loved music, made her own clothes, and painted for pleasure. More sealed and forgotten spaces turned up in the years that followed, eventually pushing the house's confirmed room count past its long-quoted number, and every single one of them showed the same thing: careful, deliberate design, not chaos. A house built to confuse wandering spirits would look random. These rooms didn't. They looked planned, finished, and cared for. To be fair, the atmosphere in that house is genuinely real. Walk through it as the light fades, and it's easy to feel something crawl up the back of your neck. That feeling isn't fake, but a feeling isn't evidence either, and the burden of proof was never really on the people asking questions. It was on a story that leaned on a medium nobody can find, a curse nobody ever wrote down in her lifetime, and construction figures no ledger has ever supported. So the real mystery of the Winchester Mystery House was never really about ghosts. It's about how a private, well-educated, financially sharp woman, someone who reportedly read Latin as a child, spoke multiple languages, managed her own estate, and quietly funded causes she cared about, got reduced, after her death, to a cartoon of madness, mostly because she never gave any interviews to correct it, and because the true version of her life simply didn't sell as many tickets as the invented one. Recent biographers and researchers who've actually sat with the surviving records describe someone capable, private, and sane, not haunted by rifles, but by more than a century of people telling her story for her. If this changed the way you'll look at the next haunted house documentary you come across, think about how many other famous ghost stories might be built the exact same way, one unsourced rumor, repeated just often enough, until nobody thinks to check where it actually came from.